I think that the current recession that we've been going through really for the last 2 years, I mean, maybe it's technically over now, but we're still feeling the effects of it, have really had a profound impact on law firms. Maybe the most profound impact of any event, certainly in my professional career, which is 40 years now, in the sense that it has completely changed the way that law firms have to think about what they do. Up to this point, I think it would be fair to say that we have been in a seller's market for legal services, in which essentially the law firms defined how legal services were going to be provided, what legal work processes were going to be, how matters were going to be staffed, how they were going to be charged for, all of those kinds of things. That has fundamentally changed. In the last 2 years, we've seen the legal market switch from a seller's market to a buyer's market, in which the clients are plainly in control of the process. Now, it may seem surprising to think that clients weren't historically in control of the process, but I think you can make a pretty persuasive case that they weren't. The law firms were basically defining all of the terms of the relationship, including what legal services cost, by the way. And, the general counsels of major companies would get together at meetings of the Association of Corporate Counsel, and they would all, sort of pound the table and say, we're not going to take it anymore, these fee increases are outrageous. But at the end of the day, they still agreed to fee increases in the 6 to 8% range every single year. And they still gave more and more work to law firms, basically on those terms. If you think about it, that was an economic structure that had to come to an end at some point, just because of the cumulative effect of it. And I think that what happened 2 years ago, when the recession really set in, was that we began to see that system collapse. Arguably, it would have happened anyway, but certainly the downturn accelerated it and maybe to some extent even exacerbated it. So what happened? What replaced it? Well, what is now emerging is a new market in which the emphasis is on efficiency and cost effectiveness in the delivery of legal services. And I can tell you that that represents a huge paradigm shift in the way that people who run law firms have to think about their business. Up until 2008, I can assure you that efficiency and cost effectiveness were not even on the radar screen for people who run law firms. Instead, they were thinking about issues of growth and expansion, global footprint, how we're going to survive in the salary wars for the next class of associates, all that kind of stuff. It was all about growth, growth, growth. But nothing about efficiency, because there was nothing in the system that forced a focus or incentivized efficiency. That's what has fundamentally changed. So what are law firms doing in response to it? Well, they're actually beginning to be pretty creative and pretty innovative. So we're seeing firms that are looking at fundamental kinds of questions, like how do we redesign the legal work process to make it more efficient? How do we change our staffing patterns to make it more efficient? How do we look at the structure of law firms? And in the future, law firms are probably not going to look like they used to look. For one thing, in terms of associates and partners, they're going to be smaller. But you're going to have a much wider range of professionals. You're going to have contract lawyers and staff attorneys and special counsel and all kinds of people who are not in the traditional sort of partner and partner-in-waiting mold that we've had in the past. So all of that is changing. I think firms are getting more serious about training and professional development because they have to. It no longer makes sense to reinvent the wheel every time you have a new matter. It no longer makes sense to train new associates on the dime of your client. That was the world before 2008. That's not the world now. So one of the impacts that I think all of this has on pro bono, this is kind of a very roundabout way of answering your question. I think that in terms of pro bono, we are beginning to see pro bono as a real differentiator in firms. Firms are beginning to think about how pro bono can be an integral part of their professional development and training programs, how pro bono can be used as a way of helping particularly younger lawyers get the kinds of skill sets that they're going to need. And I think there's also a realization that to do that responsibly, those younger lawyers have to be under the supervision of senior lawyers. So that's part of it. Pro bono, in some sense, makes better business sense than it has in the past. I think pro bono is also increasingly being recognized by firms as a way to help build and maintain the morale of your legal staff. Because, most people went to law school for pretty idealistic reasons. And you get out in the real world and those reasons kind of dribble away over time. And I think firms today are realizing that the old system under which we had very high attrition levels of associates, before 2008 in large law firms, we were looking at attrition levels, voluntary attrition levels among associates of, 18, 19% a year. I mean, you simply can't sustain an organization with those kinds of attrition rates, particularly if the organization is supposed to be efficient and cost effective. So firms have a higher investment today than ever before in hiring the right people and in retaining those people and keeping those people throughout the course of their career. And what we've known for years as a matter of social science, is that the best way to retain people in an organization isn't just about the money. It's not just what you pay them. It's what they feel about the job, whether they feel that what they're doing is important, whether it's recognized, whether it's making some kind of difference. And I think firms are beginning to recognize that pro bono is a key way in which you create that kind of job satisfaction and really play into some of the reasons that people went to law school to begin with. Now, obviously, from those of us who've been involved in pro bono for a long time, you start with the fact that you do pro bono because it's the right thing to do and because it's our responsibility as a profession. But I think these business reasons are also going to be very important in terms of how firms relate to pro bono going forward. In terms of PBI's role in the evolution of pro bono, I think I can get a little nostalgic because I want to go back 20 years and talk about what pro bono was in the legal market 20 years ago. And what pro bono was 20 years ago was something that was deeply felt by a number of individual lawyers and a handful of law firms. But it was a pretty cult kind of enterprise. I mean, it was the real pro bono junkies that were devoted to doing this sort of work. I think what's happened in the last 20 years is that pro bono has been mainstreamed. I mean, pro bono has now become part of the benchmark of what great law firms do. And it's become part and parcel of the professional package of what lawyers do. And I think PBI has had a huge, huge responsibility for that. I think that, there have been many factors that have contributed to it. But I think most people who are familiar with pro bono would credit PBI with a huge, huge amount of credit for that change. Going forward, I think PBI has to be willing to rethink what pro bono is all about in the same way that I think law firms have to be willing to do so. Just as the sort of economic models and the structural models and the service delivery models for paying work is changing within law firms, I think we have to be open to changes in models for pro bono as well. One of the interesting changes that we've seen in the last couple of years, for example, that PBI has been very influential in, has been convincing firms to think strategically about pro bono. If you're in a law firm that's investing, hundreds of thousands of hours a year in a particular kind of enterprise, then the question is, okay, are we doing that in the best way? Are we getting the maximum bang for the buck in terms of the investment we're making? Are we really doing it in a way that's helping the communities we want to help? Is it helping the lawyers who are participating in it? And so the whole idea, the whole notion of thinking strategically about pro bono is something that I think is going to be incredibly important going forward. But that's only one example. I think just as legal process is being redesigned for paying work, legal process needs to be redesigned for pro bono work. We need to be thinking very creatively about in providing pro bono services, how can we maximize the impact of the lawyer's time? Does everything in a particular matter have to be done by a lawyer? Isn't there increasing role for non-lawyer professionals in pro bono, just as there is in paying work? And how do we integrate that so as to get even bigger impact from the time that lawyers are investing? And I frankly think that PBI is on the cutting edge of a lot of those issues, certainly in terms of its consulting work and its educational work. And I think that PBI will continue to lead the way in sort of these bold new experiments in what pro bono will look like over the next 10 years.